Okay, no problem. And thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to in particular thank Jen, Jessica and Mark from the University of Leicester for the invitation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Hawkeye Youth Centre for the money that brought me here today. They used to really encourage us to come to the UK. They're a little bit more nervous about it now. And I said, stop playing for UK mates so much, but it's lovely to actually be here. I would also like to just say how wonderful it is to be sharing the stage tonight with Kate and Nicola. Kate's work is a wonderful inspiration to Australian makers. Whenever we ask about sustainability in that ARC project, it's Kate's work that they often refer to as something that really drives and inspires them. And it's always wonderful to catch up with my dear colleague and friend Nicola. I'm very jet lagged, so I was going to read this presentation. My apologies for that. But I do know there's probably a lot of people in the room who are vaguely sleepless anyway and are possibly shell-shocked. And so you're probably in a similar space to me anyway. And as Jen's already touched upon, I actually think it's much more important that what I'm going to talk about today, I actually think is going to resonate a bit more in light of the last 24 hours. One of the things I'll be talking about today, and it's certainly borne out in my empirical research, is that the craft economy, as I've been studying it, especially around design craft or craft and making, it's very much still a local economy. It's enabled by the internet, and networking is afforded very well by the internet, but it's still mostly a local economy in Australia where people talk to other people directly, engage with other people directly. And I think it's those kind of communities seeking out better possibilities that is something we very much need in this day and age. And what I'm talking about today is drawn from the book that was mentioned. I was asked to speak to some material from that. I don't necessarily encourage you to race out now and buy it. Like many academic books, it's ridiculously expensive, and even though it's now available in paperback. But if you could encourage your university or local library to purchase it, that would be wonderful. So I'll launch into it now. I don't need to tell you who are here tonight that craft, very broadly conceived, and I know there's an event on Friday, it's looking at craft beer and wines, is everywhere. There is no one-size-fits-all reason for this. As sociologist Richard Sennett has observed, words like creativity carry a lot of class baggage, as too now, I would argue, does craft. And indeed, without wanting to make a nostalgic fetish of resilience and making do cultural practices, arguably the working class has always been DIY, and for some, making one's own garments and other items is still indicative of being down at heel. But at a time of profound change in the global materiality of production, and in a society swamped with mass-manufactured goods, the handmade is in demand. Many factors have been identified as fueling this by various commentators and academics. Among them, and I'll just list a whole lot, a shift in the necessity and cultural acceptability of private cultures of austerity resulting from the GFC, and I know lots of people at the event today and in the room now are working around ideas of austerity. Nostalgia, including nostalgia for what some people refer to as a more materially substantive past. Gen X and Gen Y's desire to create or recreate a perfect family home environment for their own children, one less connected to the digital world and not always connected to the digital world. Feminist and or artist campaigns for recognition of the creative value of the fibre arts in the face of its historical devaluing as women's domestic unpaid activity, the new networking and production and consumption affordances of the internet, and the rise of crafts-based activism. Others note the cyclical nature of revivals, including craft revivals, observing that the familiarity of styles, activities and ideas of the past are frequently looked to as a direct response to the contemporary world, especially at times of crisis, instability and anxiety. Hybrid traditions, or the past itself, is seen to offer a sense of security otherwise absent. Probably can see that today too. And its styles are ripe for picking as a fashion set by a fashion system known for its repackaging of historical trends. A conservative nostalgia linked to the nostalgic desire for a treat emphasises security in the home. And I can see here links, we were talking a little bit today about Norwegian and Finnish practices, and forgive me if I pronounce this incorrectly, the idea of hygge, spelled hygge, comfort, coziness. This idea of just creating this lovely space in the home is something that's permeated certainly beyond the Nordic countries. And with a concurrent rise in interest in simple home cooking, comfort food, domestic crafts such as knitting and sewing, So certainly Joanne Turney in her work on knitting draws upon the work of feminist historian Leonore Davidoff, who includes women's craft practice alongside farmhouse cookery, organic gardening and winemaking as part of a larger contemporary emphasis on creative homemaking as a suburban substitute for authenticity. All this is made possible by the increasingly middle-class value placed on the handmade and making itself. Given all this, it is important to remember that in all its diversity, the contemporary craft economy is a site of multiple and often competing making and political imperatives. And in the book, I tried to capture this, I don't know how well you can see this, in the idea of a continuum. And writing about 2 years ago, Etsy was very much the focus of a lot of the energy and renewed interest. And I certainly have found in my research in Australia, Etsy subsiding as a key player, and other spaces are becoming more important in Australia, mostly Instagram, even for sales. But just trying to get a sense of the diversity of craft practice out there. It's a lot of things going on. And one of the things I found when I was presenting on craft, less so now, mercifully, was there's a real emphasis on the tatty side. People might remember Etsy, the place where people were posting stuff that was bought on or available on Etsy. I have no idea what some people were thinking here, but yes. So the contemporary craft economy is about far more than this, and far more than Etsy-style tat. It encompasses making practices such as ceramics, woodworking, glass blowing that have been with us for millennia precisely on account of their fundamental place in making the basics to sustain life. And one of the people we're interviewed now practice is also a knife maker who's very much in demand. It includes art and studio craft practices that similarly have long been valued for their place in stirring the human imagination. Craft practice can be conservative or backward-looking, progressive and forward-thinking, radical or resigned. In short, is a site of contestation over both political containment and possibility. It can be amateur or professional, often sometimes both at the same time, skilled and unskilled, results-intensive or innovative, as Kate's work beautifully demonstrates in terms of reimagining production and use. And despite this complexity, despite this, attitudes to the politics of craft can all too often tend to be polarised around similar extremes as its attitudes to its aesthetics. That is, you either love it or hate it. Given the competing forces at play, it is certainly important to heed Theodore Adorno's words, and my apologies for getting a little bit theoretical here. Whenever handicraft is established as a norm today, one must closely examine the intention. The concept of handicraft stands in close relationship to function. Its functions, however, are by no means necessarily enlightened or advanced. Glenn Adamson, the British writer many of you may well know, expressed similar sentiments more recently, and to quote him, "For even if workmanship is really nothing more than an actualisation of a pre-existing idea, it is still an investment. This is obviously true in the sense that craft costs money, and so wherever it manifests itself, a cultural observer should be ready to look for the interests involved." So while craft making and craft badge consumption has grown during a period of economic global uncertainty, and 21st labour is generally becoming increasingly insecure and precarious, we need to think, therefore, and ask the question, cui bono, who benefits? Nonetheless, I will argue here that in order to not close off the real possibilities for positive alternative economic practices emerging within the craft economy, questioning craft should be done not only with an eye to theoretical critique, but also to bringing forth at the more everyday level of action the alternative social imaginaries it makes possible, and these include economic imaginaries that are in play here. Therefore, while also being critically attentive to counter-arguments that focus on small-scale craft production, in the words of one academic critic, as something which makes a fetish of the artisanal quality of labour as another way of avoiding the question of labour, given craft's inability to scale up to industrial levels of production, end quote. I think it is useful to situate contemporary craft critically within wider scholarly and activist debates around alternative economic models, especially the especially the shift to local and or microeconomic practices. While acknowledging the important critiques to be made about creative microenterprise, some of my own key ones that are emerging, especially in the study, are the aspects of the individualisation of risk and responsibility for employment. We're finding a lot of graduates are going out there trying to set up a business as a creative practitioner, and very many of them will fail. But increasingly society enables that and encourages that, displacing risk and responsibility for creating jobs. And the other one we're really finding is the masking of women's underemployment. There are a lot of women who've often left jobs outside the home because they've had families, and often in the creative industries, and their employers have been quite hostile to childcare responsibilities. And so a lot of these women have taken up a professional business at home as a way of getting identity and maintaining a role in the public world. I nonetheless would argue that to dismiss those seeking a better world through craft as simply middle-class victims of seductive cool capitalism, in the words of Jim McGuigan, is to reinscribe in a new context old Marxist ideas of false consciousness. Rather, and with a view to acknowledging the possibilities of the alternative social imaginaries clearly evident within the contemporary craft economy, drawing upon the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, I wish here to briefly examine the contemporary craft economy as an active strategy of taking back the economy, largely on the part of women. Artisanal production, and craft in particular, is often critiqued for not being able to scale up, and thus is accused of producing things only rich people can really afford, while importantly reminding us of the Western middle-class nature of bespoke consumer culture. This is in other ways a little beside the point. While the long-tail craft market is increasingly rendering the handmade more affordable to more people, the lack of scale, that is the desire for the handmade marketplace to operate as an alternative to or within industrial capitalism, is precisely the intention of an overwhelming number of those active in these scenes. And one of the things we're encountering in our research project is most people don't want to become employers. They don't want to scale up. They don't want to get too big, which very much flies in the face of governmental desires that small businesses and self-employed businesses become employers in the future. People get into making because they like making, not because they like doing business accounts and being responsible for OHS surveys. So it's a heroic can-do of the middle class. As with ethical consumption, it's very easy to dismiss this precisely as the heroic can-do of the middle classes, if looking down from a global perspective on the immediate possibility of the handmade becoming a serious alternative to global production chains. But to disdain the humanly compromised but nonetheless powerfully effective drivers at work here, and the solutions to which they point and which are visible precisely because of the relatively privileged position of the cultural economic practices, is to close off valuable discussion around alternatives to current environmentally and socially exploitative practices. To, like Mackenzie White, the critic I spoke about earlier, evoke Marx, albeit at the level of the individual worker rather than the institutional level, and I quote, Marx modelled his idea of non-alienated or meaningful work on craftsmanship. One of the main reasons why the division of labour would make work less meaningful was that it undermined the very possibility of craftsmanship, unquote. Time is indeed money, and in many ways Marx could not have foreseen the contemporary craft economy, dominated by women, offers us interesting perspectives on how both are being revalued in the face of industrialisation by those fortunate enough to be in a position to negotiate between variously compromised choices. In her work on the UK's mumpreneurs, Carol Eckensmith's research reveals that for many of her respondents, the choice to identify as a mumpreneur rather than an entrepreneur, and I think today especially you might not want to identify as an entrepreneur, is a very deliberate one. They make this choice for a number of reasons, including, she lists, the targeted networking possibilities this identification opens up, the desire to make a clear statement about the need for motherhood and successful economic participation to be reconcilable in the contemporary economy, but also, and significantly, to make a statement about the way in which they conduct their business. To quote from her research, there were those who had what could be typified as conventional goals of growth and profit enhancement. Other respondents were content to keep the business within manageable bounds. All were concerned that the business should not grow so quickly so as to compromise family life. Keeping the brakes on the business was an imperative until such time as they had the time or resources to allow expansion. Thus, these mumpreneurs have goals that reach beyond the economic. They are not, in more ways than the obvious, the rational economic men of traditional economics, but businesswomen motivated by the rational desire to achieve work-life harmony, end quote. For these women, the last thing that they wish to do is identify themselves with figures I wrote 2 years ago, such as Richard Branson and, heaven forbid, Donald Trump. Didn't write the heaven forbid, but he was in there. And their worlds of neoliberal capitalist big business. Thus, notably for many mumpreneurs, the point is precisely not to get too big, not to grow beyond a desired level of work-life manageability and also potentially sustainability in terms of environmental impact. In this context, small, largely home-based businesses are being championed as an alternative production and consumption practice within unsustainable environmentally and in terms of human rights, global industrialisation. Precisely like the farmers' markets, slow living practices, barter, local exchange trading systems, and a myriad of alternative communication exchanges, the contemporary craft economy is often overtly positioned by many of its champions within the larger picture of emerging microeconomic activities. This then brings back into view the need to simultaneously acknowledge the real agency and desire to do good work, as was mentioned earlier, to produce and consume ethically, underpinning the creative craft economy for many people, while also never losing sight of the tremendous potential for new modes of economic exploitation, especially self-exploitation. These people are often working very long hours. This is especially the case given that, as Leicester's very own Mark Banks has argued, craft labour practices appear to be becoming more rather than less significant to creative industry production and policy making. Online craft distribution sites such as Etsy have captured the imagination of so many, in part precisely because of the way they operate explicitly speaks to their desire for altruistic individualism and thus for connection, to be linked into political and social worlds bigger than themselves. The constant flux and negotiation is not only a negative force, it also represents a space for contestation as part of a larger game of freedom versus containment played by relatively privileged citizens of the global West in the face of capitalist demands that they wish to challenge or reject. And it's interesting to see in Australia, Etsy, most people aren't having a huge amount of success selling on it, but they often go to its community forums. They're still often really involved in its networks and support online systems. They go to it for information about business skills, how to set up a website, how to do things like pricing, but they're not actually selling on it, but they see it as a community resource. It's just not necessarily what Etsy would ideally, I suppose, intend for it. So following Gibson Graham, who was unfortunately one of the authors has now died. For those of you who don't know, they're feminist economists, two women who wrote under the one nom de plume. I argue that to dismiss attempts at ethical craft microenterprise is to erase or close off alternative economic possibilities, or to at least the will to embrace them. And to do this is to do hegemonic capitalism's job for it. There is a strong element of dig where you stand permeating the environmental, labour and gender politics of much of the contemporary craft economy. There is a shift too from a focus on politics as explicitly lived out in the public realm of the polis, as distinct from the private world of the oikos. For Western women especially, the home and decisions around its maintenance have been, for reasons both patriarchal and feminist, the locus for political engagement and action for a long time. The added layer of women's increased paid labour expectations, coupled with social and financial pressures to be employed, renders the interface of paid labour and the home a logical 21st century site of economic contestation for both women and men across the global West. It is for these reasons, precisely because of Lisa Atkin's idea of the folding of the economy in society, which she looks at the way in which, I suppose, we could look at economic rationalism as having taken over the social and cultural spaces as well, which is very much coming out to bear in politics these days, that this site needs to be an actively engaged one of essential critique, but also of action and possibility, especially for those privileged enough to be in a position to have some degree of choice in this structuring of these relations. In this space, the quest for environmentally sustainable and non-exploitative consumption emerges as a middle-class site whereby in the process of social change, the unofficial sphere of everyday life often forms the basis of political opposition. This is a clear instance of what Featherstone, interpreting Foucault, evokes as the exploration of an active art of living, whereby, to quote, a way of life can generate a culture and an ethics. For Foucault implies that a way of life is an ethics, a way of being together, of being with others, which generates a shared space. This space is one of experimentation in forming a polis, that is, in making politics, which emphasises the political character of ethics, unquote. Female-dominated craft practice also foregrounds the domestic, the home or the domestic space as a fundamental shared space where the politics of an art of living must also be negotiated in porous dialogue with the outside world. So I just want to be clear, I'm not seeking to champion the whole of the craft economy as a revolutionary movement. It's predicated largely on middle-class consumption, sometimes of stuff you really don't need and probably shouldn't buy. Not necessarily regrets it, but just do you really need that 25th pair of earrings, Susan? But there's a lot of stuff out there that it's a recreational space in some ways. There's also, as I said, it's glasses, it's tableware, it's things that we just need to live. But like Gibson Graham and others, I would argue that for a real change to be enacted, people's deeply held desires and effective relationships need to be engaged, not just their logical brains. The recognition that affect is crucial to ethical practice and interplayed with thought offers clues to how one might cultivate oneself differently, Gibson Graham writes. Excuse me. Thus, to dismiss the will to good work and good lives, variously driving makers across the sector, and the personal and financial risks many are willing to take to realise these, is, as Gibson Graham argues, to uphold a vision of an all-powerful capitalism offering no way out. Indeed, is to build up a capitalism discursively as a more thoroughly singular, hegemonic and all-powerful entity, despite its clear and present weaknesses and complexities, as witnessed by the GFC among other sides of contestation. We need to think instead, they argue, in terms of diverse economies, not a singular market. This opens up such questions as, are people on the planet well served by this system? If not, what other economic structures are possible? After all, those engaging in self-employment are seeking to create the conditions under which they might appropriate their own surplus labour, rather than having it appropriated within capitalist firms, and at the same time enjoy a standard of living and decent working conditions. So while I do share and acknowledge concerns about the all too frequently neoliberal agenda of creative industries, in Australia, believe you me, I really do, I do not wish here to throw the baby out with the bathwater and dismiss the millions of people variously engaged in building alternative economic frameworks through making as naive dupes. I concur with the aforementioned Banks when he speaks of how, despite the primacy of an instrumental rationality, contemporary capitalism is a sufficiently imperfect operation to accommodate a broad range of moral values that will potentially affect a diversity of outcomes at the level of practice, unquote. Fundamental to this is a more complex reading of the impacts, not only negative, of the blurring of the boundaries between work and non-work, which can provide conditions for the increased integration and overlap of hypherto separate rounds of obligation, as Mark writes, that can interact to affect forms of workplace identity that exhibit morally complex characteristics, some of which are translatable into socially useful actions. It's really bizarre when you read somebody else's words, you're not used to the cadence of them in your own mouth. In this way, the contemporary craft economy, or perhaps more accurately economies, can be read for difference rather than dominance, which seeks to call into question the mechanistic logics of reproduction, growth, accumulation, commodification, concentration and centralisation on which capitalism's naturalness and naturalised dominance are grounded. As something of an, if not dropout, then downshifted cultural economy, those who deliberately have chosen or for whom circumstances have dictated a different way of going about their business have demonstrated that alternative markets and their social worlds are possible. While many businesses will fail, many are also succeeding and thus offer the evidence that alternatives exist in the form of self-employment, which continues to attract people precisely on account of the greater freedom it affords. Moving forward to the mixed economy, we are clearly not there yet, far from it, but to dismiss middle-class downshifting and the renaissance of making out of hand on the basis of privilege is to ignore the fact that if those with the education and income to start moving in the direction of better choices are not starting to operate as change agents in this space, who will? Those who consume most vociferously should be held more accountable for how they do so, which leads then to a questioning of when and what to consume, how much and from where. We can see here elements of a mingling of 21st century concerns with a more Aristotelian moral economy, which is manifest as an art of living, as I've mentioned, predicated upon prudential learning, knowing how to set measures to one's behaviour, to limit one's ambitions, and desires, to exercise self-control, and to behave in a dignified and socially responsible manner. The contemporary craft economy is in this way part of a larger trend across the global West. As Kate Serper has written, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these kind of arguments. New conceptions of the good life appear to be gaining a hold amongst some affluent customers. In that sense, there is more of a questioning attitude towards the supposed blessings of consumerism. People are starting to see the pleasures of affluence both as compromised by their negative effects and as preempting other enjoyments. The enjoyment of previously unquestioned activities such as driving or flying, eating out of season strawberries that have been transported halfway around the world, or I hear avocado is a particularly topical thing here. It's topical in Australia because it's something the middle class have thrown at young people and said you're not allowed to eat if you want to afford housing, but somehow the avocado has become a key player in the hipster debates around current economies. They've been transported halfway around the world, or buying a new refrigerator is now tainted by a sense of their side effects. The pleasures of the consumerist lifestyle as a whole are troubled by an intuition of the other pleasures that it constrains or destroys, especially that would follow from a slower, less work-dominated pace of life. Thus, to look at the contemporary craft economy through the joint lens of good work and intentional economies, that is, as a project that treats the economy as a political and ethical space of decision, is not simply to dismiss genuinely active and strongly felt practices of creating economic alternatives, or as a cynical marketing or smug self-satisfaction. And this is one of the arguments that's been made within cultural studies quite a bit. There's quite a lot of work that's been done around by autonomous Marxists critiquing creative industries as just being at the forefront of neoliberal economies and just at the vanguard of, I suppose, creating a lot of precarious work. These are very legitimate critiques to be made, obviously. Similar criticisms have been made by, for example, Bertansky and Schiapello, who, I'll just leave that up in the background, talk about capitalism's ability to retain, its ability to soak up new things. Anyone who's done subcultural studies will know the very basic premise of this. You know, it's a way of reinvigorating capitalism and consumer cultures. So there's a big, strong argument that the contemporary craft economy, whether it's bespoke gin or Etsy kind of goods, is just part and parcel of this, a particular selling of an authenticity in this contemporary kind of marketplace where we're on digital screens, and the fetishization of the analogue is just part of all this. But my base argument is just to say, and to repeat the point, that there's a lot more going on in this space than just that kind of consumption of difference. So to conclude, is the cup half empty or half full? In part, this depends upon whether you accept, as per Gibbs and Graham, among others, that the most effective political agenda is to work towards a mixed economy, or whether you still hold out hope for more revolutionary structural overthrow of capitalism. Moreover, our capacity to imagine what new social and political imaginaries should and could look like, not to mention that there will be enough of a workable planet left to occupy to realise these, reveals a tension between invaluable analysis that makes sense of the structures within which activism operates and the need to act quickly in the here and now. Powerfully, many of the stories, largely from women leaping out from the contemporary craft economy, speak of people feeling empowered to take more steps towards further, deeper change, having taken initial ones. That the seductions of neoliberalism are embedded within and in many ways realised by the craft economy, and these require ongoing attentive critique and challenge. We can also see here some possible conditions for cultural transformation in imminent social relations. Social imaginaries count. While capitalist frameworks representing the interests of the powerful may seek to limit the identities and paths we are offered, to negotiate the world we need other cultural imaginaries within the social field to draw upon. Craft's moment in the sun will go. It will fade. It's a particular trend that's there now. But making, craft practice, good work, craftsmanship or craftswomanship, these things will persist. And I think it's the particular values underlying those which are timeless and have stood across millennia that are the important ones to look towards in this context as we think through what contemporary possibilities there are for a more sustainable mixed economy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.